Imagine a device so terrifying, its very name conjures images of unspeakable torment. For centuries, the British Empire wielded power through fear. But few methods were as chilling as the legendary Iron Virgin. This instrument of discipline, wrapped in cold steel and shadowed by whispers of blood, was more than a tool of punishment. It was a symbol of empire itself, an empire that thrived not only through trade and conquest, but through fear, humiliation, and control. What secrets does this brutal instrument hold about the true face of imperial rule? And why, even now, does its story echo with lessons about power, dignity, and justice? The Iron Virgin, sometimes called the Iron Maiden, was a coffin-like structure, tall and narrow, designed to envelop a human body. Its inside bristled with spikes, carefully positioned so that when the heavy door closed, flesh met iron. The victim was not instantly killed, but pressed slowly into agony, their skin punctured, their chest compressed, their very breath stolen inch by inch. Whether through death or terror, its message was clear. To defy the masters of empire was to invite suffering beyond imagination. Although scholars still debate whether every tale of the Iron Virgin is literal truth or partly legend, what matters most is how the British used the idea of it. For the empire understood something sinister. Fear itself can be as powerful as steel. A story whispered through a colony of a man taken into the Iron Virgin and never seen again could silence an entire community more effectively than soldiers with guns. Discipline, after all, was not only about punishment, it was about teaching obedience, branding rebellion as futile, and making cruelty a language of authority. Across the empire, from India to Africa, from the Caribbean to Ireland, instruments of discipline became as common as the flags fluttering over government houses. The Iron Virgin was a symbol among many, but it carried the weight of theater. Its towering form, its merciless spikes, its very design suggested that human dignity itself could be swallowed whole by imperial will. People whispered about it in hushed tones, mothers warned their children, and rebels knew it was not just their bodies, but their very spirit that would be caged in steel. Imagine the world in which this device thrived. The British Empire was not merely a network of colonies. It was a machine of power that reached into daily lives. Taxes were enforced with lashes, protests met with bullets, and silence demanded through the instruments of terror. The Iron Virgin, in this sense, was not just a coffin of spikes, it was the metaphor of empire itself. A coffin into which nations were forced, pressed tightly against the blades of exploitation, drained of their strength but not permitted to die. Yet beyond the machinery of discipline lay the human cost, the stories often forgotten, buried beneath the official records of governors and generals. Picture the enslaved worker on a Caribbean plantation, accused of disobedience, dragged before his masters as an example to others. The Iron Virgin stood in the corner like a silent witness, its presence enough to bend the will of those watching. Even if the device was not always used, its shadow broke spirits. It reminded men and women that their lives were never truly their own. To resist was to risk vanishing into its jaws. For black men and women under British rule, the Iron Virgin was more than punishment, it was the denial of humanity. Each spike represented not only pain but the empire's message: you are not free. You are not equal. You exist only by our permission. The cruelty of the Iron Virgin was part of a larger system that sought to strip away dignity, silence voices, and erase cultures. This was not discipline. It was domination, cold and deliberate, but cruelty always leaves its mark. The empire's obsession with discipline etched scars, not only on the bodies of its subjects, but on the memory of generations in India. Stories of brutal punishments became part of folk memory, fueling resistance movements that demanded dignity and justice. In Africa, tales of torment were passed down, reminders of how deeply the iron of empire had cut into their history. And in the Caribbean, where enslaved Africans bore the harshest torments, the idea of the Iron Virgin blended with the memory of chains, whips, and branding irons, a cruel trinity of tools that defined their suffering. What makes this story truly haunting is that the Iron Virgin was not always visible. Sometimes, it appeared only in rumors spoken of in prisons, described by survivors, whispered among rebels. But the empire understood the power of whispers. What people believe can often be as effective as what they see. The legend of the Iron Virgin, whether wielded in fact or fiction, was carefully sustained as a deterrent. In this way, the empire weaponized imagination itself. And yet, no empire lasts forever. The cruelty that sustains power eventually seeds rebellion. As the empire expanded, so too did resistance. People began to see through the theater of terror, to understand that fear was designed to keep them from realizing their collective strength. The Iron Virgin, once a symbol of invincibility, became instead a reminder of oppression. It became a story told not only with horror but with anger, a symbol of why freedom had to be fought for at any cost. Consider this. While the empire wielded its Iron Virgin to terrify those who resisted, wielded memory to endure. Songs, stories, and whispered prayers became their weapons. Where iron tried to silence, voices kept speaking. Where spikes tried to break the body, spirit rose in defiance. And in this clash between steel and soul, the empire revealed its own weakness. For no amount of discipline, no matter how brutal, could erase the human desire for dignity. The Iron Virgin may have been built of cold metal, but it was powered by something far more calculated, the empire's deliberate choice to rule through fear. And therein lies the true brutality. For it is one thing to punish, it is another to make cruelty a cornerstone of governance. The British Empire, like others before it, believed it could secure obedience by destroying hope. But history shows us the opposite. The more vicious the discipline, the more determined the resistance. As we look back at the Iron Virgin, we see more than a device of torment. We see the reflection of an empire that measured its strength not in justice or equality, but in how long it could hold nations in its spiked embrace. We see the cost paid by millions who endured its shadow, and we begin to ask, how much of this legacy still lingers in the world today? The Iron Virgin may belong to history, but the lessons it carries are alive. Power built on fear will always face the reckoning of memory. And when we remember these instruments of cruelty, we are not only telling stories of suffering, we are reclaiming dignity for those whose voices were silenced. The story of the Iron Virgin does not end with the closing of its steel door. Its legacy reaches far beyond the chambers of punishment, seeping into the fabric of colonial life and into the memories of entire peoples. To understand the British Empire's brutal discipline, we must see the Iron Virgin not only as an object but as a symbol and emblem of a system that chose fear over fairness, domination over dignity, And in this recognition, we discover how deeply the scars of empire remain etched into our modern world. Imagine a young man in colonial India, accused of defiance for refusing to bow low enough before an officer. He has not stolen, he has not killed, he has merely held his head too high. He is dragged to the station house, where rumors swirl about a dreadful iron coffin that swallows rebels whole. Whether or not the device is actually present is almost irrelevant. The terror is real, for the whisper of its existence is enough to weaken his resolve. Here lies the genius and the cruelty of imperial discipline. It was not about one punishment, but about shaping a world where every subject believed resistance would bring unimaginable pain. The British understood something older empires had practiced before them. Violence works best when it lingers in the mind. Ancient Rome crucified rebels along public roads, forcing passersby to walk through corridors of suffering. In the same way, the British Empire paraded stories of the Iron Virgin whippings and executions to remind colonized people that they were trapped in a system where mercy was scarce. Just as Rome built its empire on spectacle, Britain sustained its rule on the theater of discipline. But what happens when such brutality collides with the human yearning for justice? History offers us countless examples of how cruelty breeds resistance. In Jamaica, the echoes of iron and whip gave birth to the Maroons, communities of escaped enslaved people who fought against the empire's authority. In South Africa, in India, and in Ireland, stories of brutal discipline fed movements that would eventually demand each punishment, each act of humiliation, instead of erasing rebellion, planted seeds of it. The empire thought fear would last forever, but memory proved stronger. And what of the individuals, the nameless, voiceless millions, whose suffering was never recorded? For every tale of the Iron Virgin, there are countless others of whippings, brandings, public hangings, and forced labor. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a system. To maintain global control over diverse populations, the empire relied on a vast machinery of discipline. Courts were rigged, punishments were swift, and mercy was rare. The Iron Virgin was one grotesque cog in this machine, but its symbolism tells us everything we need to know about the nature of imperial rule. That order was prized above humanity, and obedience valued above justice. Consider the lasting psychological effect of such discipline. Generations of colonized people grew up under the shadow of fear. Children learned to obey before they learned to dream. Communities were silenced before they could speak freely. Even after the empire collapsed, the echoes of its discipline remained. Systems of policing, prisons, and punishment in former colonies often mirrored the empire's design, as if the Iron Virgin had left behind not just scars but blueprints. This is why the story of the Iron Virgin matters today. It is not simply an artifact of history, a curiosity locked away in a museum. It is a reminder of how power can manipulate fear to control lives. It is a lesson about how stories of terror, whether exaggerated or real, can shape entire societies. And it is a warning. Whenever fear is used as a substitute for justice, humanity itself is placed inside the coffin of spikes. Yet, there is another side to this story, one not of despair but of defiance. For as much as the empire tried to bury hope beneath iron, people always found ways to resist. A whispered prayer in a prison cell, a secret meeting in a field at night, a song sung in defiance of silence. These were acts of courage that no spike could pierce. Resistance was not always grand or immediate. Sometimes it was simply survival. To live another day under oppression, to hold on to dignity in the face of humiliation, was itself a form of rebellion. This resilience is why the British Empire eventually fractured. It could conquer land, it could break bodies, but it could not extinguish the will of the people it ruled. The Iron Virgin may have silenced individuals, but it could never silence nations forever. India rose with the voice of Gandhi and the fire of revolutionaries. Africa demanded independence with both protest and armed struggle. The Caribbean, long scarred by slavery and brutal discipline, nurtured leaders who spoke of dignity and self-determination. In every corner of the former empire, the memory of cruelty became fuel for freedom. Looking back now, the Iron Virgin is almost unthinkable. How could human beings devise such a machine, much less justify its use in the name of order? But this question forces us to confront a deeper truth, that empires, in their pursuit of power, often abandon morality. The British Empire justified its discipline by calling it civilizing, claiming that harsh measures were necessary to govern unruly peoples. This language of justification is perhaps more chilling than the device itself, for it cloaked cruelty in the disguise of duty. It told the world that suffering was progress, that spikes were steps toward civilization. And in believing this lie, the empire revealed its deepest brutality, not only in action but in thought. Today, when we walk through museums or read history books, the Iron Virgin may appear as a relic, an object from a dark past, but its legacy is not locked behind glass. It lingers in the inequalities, the systemic injustices, and the racial hierarchies that empire left behind. For the same logic that justified the Iron Virgin, the belief that some lives are worth less than others still shapes parts of our world. Every time dignity is denied, every time fear is used to silence, we hear the echo of iron closing shut. And yet, to remember is to resist. By telling these stories, by naming the instruments of cruelty, we strip them of their power. We reclaim dignity for those who suffered and give voice to those who were silenced. We remind ourselves that humanity survives even in the darkest of times. The Iron Virgin may have been built to erase resistance, but in the end, it became a symbol of why resistance is necessary. So, as we close this story, let us return to the image we began with. A coffin of iron, bristling with spikes, standing as a monument to empire's cruelty. It is a terrifying image, yes, but it is also a mirror. It reflects not only the past but the dangers of any future where fear replaces justice. The British Empire's brutal discipline is a warning across time, that power maintained by cruelty cannot endure, and that dignity, though denied, will always rise again. The Iron Virgin reminds us of the price of silence and the cost of forgetting, but it also reminds us of resilience, of voices that sang even as chains rattled, of spirits that endured even as spikes pressed close. In telling this story, we honor them. We say their pain was not in vain. We say their dignity lives on in the memory of their struggle. Because in the end, the empire's iron has rusted. But the human spirit, scarred though it may be, continues to shine. And that is the true revelation of the Iron Virgin, just a tale of torment, but a testament to survival.